Welcome to another episode of Team Anywhere, where CEOs, leaders, and experts at building teams,
companies,
organizations,
and amazing cultures share how to lead from anywhere in the world. I'm your co-host on the East Coast, Ginny Bianco Mathis.
And I'm your co-host on the West Coast, Mitch Simon. And we invite you to join us to Team Anywhere.
Do people follow leaders? Well, actually, people follow story. Real leadership comes from being skilled in managing beliefs through knowing how to own the story. On today's podcast, we have Don Schmincke, author and coach to tens of thousands of CEOs. You'll really enjoy his experience, attitude, and counterintuitive approach to get people to follow you from anywhere. Hello and welcome to another episode of Team Anywhere. I'm your co-host on the West Coast, Mitch Simon, and on the East Coast, we've got our amazing co-host, Dr. Virginia Bianco Mathis. How you doing, Ginny, this afternoon, I think?
Great. I'm doing great now that we got my mic all straightened out.
All right, great. Well, today on the podcast, we have best-selling author, speaker, and course creator, Don Schmincke. Don has had his books translated into over 12 languages and has presented in front of more than 10,000 CEOs. Who does that?
Yeah.
Don is a former MIT and Johns Hopkins Institute researcher turned organizational strategic development consultant. Guy CEOs bring in when all the experts fail.
Ooh.
Don, welcome to Team Anywhere. How are you doing today?
Good, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Don is on the East Coast near Baltimore, kind of where you are, Ginny.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we always start with this question. So what surprised you the most over the last 2 years when it comes to virtual leadership?
And when you say virtual, I mean like remote leading?
Yeah, remote leading. You know, there were definitely companies that went completely remote, and then there are some that are just a little bit remote and some that are in between.
What surprised me, because I was working with numbers of companies, and I probably did, maybe 150 speeches during the COVID remote isolation. Mm-hmm. And it came up a lot, like how do I lead? How do I maintain culture? How do I make sure everybody's aligned on strategy and where we're going? And I had to remind them that they had forgotten how to do that. In other words, this was not new, and that we've been leading remotely for thousands of years. Military groups, religious groups, they've been global and doing fine. So all of a sudden, our employees can't show up at the office. We start freaking out. So we had to start teaching them how to do human grouping behaviors, because basically we're a tribal species. So we like to group. And then are using symbols appropriately, rituals appropriately, or magical myths appropriately. And it was like a lot of them had no idea. They were like, oh, my God. I mean, they thought it was brilliant, but they realized that I hadn't really focused on any of that. And I said, it's not your fault. We don't teach any of this in MBA school. So, none of this. You have to be like an anthropology or an archaeologist or something to learn these things. But I said, they were easy, and you can craft and experiment with these things. So we got a lot of good traction out of that. And people became more, I think, confident, better leaders, and their remote workforces were more aligned and actually more productive sometimes.
Well, you've got to share with us, because I'm not sure all of us know, me included, what are magical myths?
Oh, yeah. Mythologies have always inspired and aligned groups because, one of the things we try to teach CEOs, because I train maybe 700 CEOs a year, and then we go into corporations to implement all this, maybe at a dozen different companies every now and then throughout the year. And I think that what we're finding when we do all that, either in our training or our corporate work, is that they forgot that people follow story. And it's kind of interesting because one of the things I come up with is how come, Steve Jobs dies? They write books about his leadership style and they say he's an asshole, which then begs another dangerous question, which no one ever asked. Why is somebody following an asshole?
Yeah.
Okay, like that never comes up in any freaking investigation of leadership. But I thought, you know what? Let's bring it up, shall we?
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is that it really shows that we're probably teaching leadership all wrong in our books, because maybe people aren't following the leader. Maybe they're following the story the leader represents. And so about 20 years ago, we started developing with companies how to create what we call a compelling saga or a winning saga. And that's where the myth comes from. You take your strategy for winning and how you're going to do it, and then you craft a drama around that, which is, again, another thing that goes in the opposite direction of what we're teaching is that, standard practices is, get rid of drama in your company. And I'm like, God, the next time you hear somebody tell you that, ask them for their peer-reviewed medical journals. Never experimented or researched. But you don't get rid of drama. Dramalessness is a pathological condition. Mm-hmm. Without it, will become ill and some will die. Tell me why you want to do this to your employees again.
Again is the key word there.
So the mythology came out of that. And when we started using it and getting people to create drama, not the mini dramas that are so functional, but the strategic dramas, the winning dramas, that's what people are following. And, and in each case, and that's why they were doing at Apple, they were following what Steve was up to. He was up to, impact, put a dent in the universe, and that's it.
Yeah, it's what he embodied.
Yes.
And sometimes, a couple of times a week, he'd go crazy and yell and scream, and yet they still saw the aura of what he was trying to move them all for. And that's what you follow.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
So then if you would write the book on why to follow an asshole, you would then say, because the asshole had a compelling saga. It was all about the story. It was all about the emotions he was in the people at Apple. Is that what you would say?
Yeah. I mean, there was a strategic journey ahead that you trusted this person to take you to, and you were following that journey, that story they represented, that they captured. And it's nice if they're a nice guy. That's even better. But if they're not, you're going to follow them anyway because they have defined for you what winning means, and you agree with that and how you're going to do it. So that's why throughout history, we've seen these episodes where these assholes were leading the creation of great civilizations or companies and, things like that.
Can you give us an example of a CEO that you've been working with lately where you crafted a strategic journey and what that journey was about and what was the impact to the employees?
Well, I can't mention names, but I mean, there were times, in fact, I have a new book coming out on entrepreneurship, and several of the people I've worked with are in the book. And so, like one gentleman, I'm sure he wouldn't mind me mentioning his name, Marco Costa Rubio, worked with him, and he had created, an Inc. 500 level performance company. And he shared with us, and it's in the book, there was an issue of like him looking at, wait a minute, maybe it's not about me, maybe it's about helping other people. And when he got that transition, it became magical. And so his performance results, of course, are, legendary within, the Inc. 500. But this is a moment where a leader has to look at themselves and say, who am I and what am I representing? Or are they really following me? And is that really that important? Or are they following what we're up to?
Right.
Great. Now, can you tell us what's your story? Like, what's your background and how did you come to a place where you are presenting in front of more than 10,000 CEOs?
How much do you want to know?
We've got 20
just
more
the
minutes
highlights,
left.
just the secret sauce, Don.
Just hit the rituals and the symbols and we're good.
I never meant to be doing this. I almost dropped out of high school. I almost didn't make my senior year until the police told me I had to finish my senior year. And then
There's a compelling story for you.
I'm like, I don't know. I want to repeat this year. So in 2 months, I did the whole senior year, and then I got out. And then I was in rock bands and stuff, and that's, a thing I was doing. But I wasn't sure where I wanted to go next. And I noticed that, I was working at my uncle's gas station. A lot of the guys driving the fancy cars had educations. So I thought, maybe I should get an education.
So
I started in a community college up the street, and they didn't care whether I showed up or not. They had my money. So I'm like, well, this is different. And it was interesting. I ran into a couple of people that, like one professor retired, and he was just teaching for fun. He was a physicist from MIT. And then somebody, Betty Starr was her name. She came out of BU. Her husband at MIT, went to MIT, and they were like, why don't you play at MIT? And I'm like, what is that? I didn't even know.
Oh, my God.
Trade school? I mean, what is this thing? And so they put me through a battery of tests, and then I got in. And then everything went crazy. And I started in electrical engineering, computer science. I started getting fascinated with AI in the early days, and then got involved with planetary physics. So that was great. I ended up working on nuclear Trident missile program. That was fun. And then automating the Harvard MIT biomedical lab. But it was in the biomedical research that by the way, I have ADHD, so that probably explains why I'm doing half a dozen things at one time. The human area became fascinating. So that's what took me to Hopkins. And then I began studying human grouping behaviors and how humans administer to each other in terms of developing these groups. And so that's when I got involved with the executive MBA area. And they started finding that, we should be researching, or they were asking questions around, could leadership be primal? Could it be biological? Because Oxford gave me permission to use this ancient manuscript. And, 700 years ago, like the samurai were running into the same organizational problems that we are today.
Fascinating.
And as I went around the world, every executive team was having the same issues. So that's where the biological question came up. And that's when I started doing it. And then that's, of course, I published the Code of the Executive. It went off into a dozen languages, and I was asked to teach and began applying these biological methods in companies, and their sales started going up 2 or 3 times or 10 times. And we started funding our own research. So I started doing expeditions around the world, hanging out with people that were smarter than I was, and they were teaching me what they were learning in their research. And so today I'm really grateful to have access to some of the brilliant minds, and they're willing to, help me understand more around our species and how to lead it. So that was a long answer to how I got here.
No, that's fascinating. And you feel, or you're channeling it into then what it is you're teaching. Yeah. So what's the fundamental difference, would you say, between how you go about trying to teach leadership versus if I picked up a typical textbook?
I think we like to focus more on, when you do a Google Scholar search on management theory of failure, you get like 4 or 5 million hits. And when I train CEOs, they've never heard this before. So I get on, go and show them. And then they're shocked. Mm-hmm. And then I share with them, well, why does every bankrupt company have all the best-selling books on their shelves? Mm-hmm. And why did the largest companies hire the authors as they went bankrupt? There's problems. We need to be asking different questions here. And what we found out is that it wasn't really the books or the theories or the experts. They were all supplying great tools, great thought leadership around how to do things and what to do. But what was happening is the failure rates were because human behavior wasn't changing. In other words, human decision was not shifting. So you throw a bunch of tools at the problem, you still get the problem.
Totally.
Because humans, their decisions don't shift. So we began searching what was happening. And we went to talk to some CEOs like Alexander the Great, Caesar, Cleopatra, Gandhi, Hannibal, Genghis Khan. And they all said, hey, we don't waste time on the tool stuff. We need to alter human decision and align it. And so your beliefs. And that's what got us to belief management. One of the courses not taught in our MBA programs is, I think, the one that allows us to conquer the world.
Yes, there we go.
And so you're teaching belief management in which school now?
Well, I'm not teaching anymore. I ended up being on a plane too much. I left Hopkins some years ago. And now what I do is I have workshops. I do about 60 or 70 speeches a year at companies that want to bring me in, or CEO groups that want to bring me in. And so that gives me a chance not only to teach, but also to learn. Because when you're with CEOs, you're able to bring in ideas. Like if I come back from Africa with some interesting concept, it gives me a place to test, and see, what has legs, what doesn't. And so for me, it's a laboratory, but also an educational forum. So I really love it because my purpose is really to learn and teach. That's what I love.
Where would our listeners go to learn more about belief management? Is it in your first book, The Code of the Executive, or is it somewhere else?
It's sprinkled throughout. The Code of the Executive is really a replication of an ancient manuscript for teaching around death and how to unhook our beliefs that may bring us to be dysfunctional. A lot of times when we accelerate the speed of executive teams, it's really around teaching them to die properly. I know it sounds crazy, but actually CEOs love doing this because, all that dysfunctional behavior, goes out the window and speed picks up. And the interesting thing is we're so used to dysfunctional behavior, we don't see it as the chronic strategic handicap that it is. And I ask these CEOs and employees how much time is wasted in dysfunctional behavior. And it's a wide range of 20 to 80%, but around 50%.
It's uncanny.
Yeah.
Well, it's hearing you talk and stories and so forth. The studies that they did with the chickens. And
yes, the chickens.
Chickens just destroy each other when you keep putting just the best with the best with the best with the best. And talk about biological mindset. Right. They'll destroy each other.
It becomes like another episode of The Office, right?
Yes.
Which people think is a comedy, but no, it's a documentary.
Yes, it is.
I know. My kids couldn't understand why I couldn't stand to watch it.
I love it.
I said, I'm sorry, this is too real. Just get it out of my face.
Yes.
Yeah, they just didn't exaggerate it. They didn't exaggerate enough. That was my problem.
Well, Don, let's say you're giving a speech, and of course, there's a wide range. What are the three major things that you're going to say about here's where your belief system needs to go? This is what needs to happen for you to be more effective.
Well, first, what I do is I like to present like a learning foundation, like the research foundation, because if I just jump in and say, okay, let's talk about genetic warfare and let's talk about death. I mean, people look at you like, whoa. But so I do spend about, the first, 20 or 30% talking about just exposing the data. We have 35,000 business books published every year. That's like a shock to the audience.
Right.
Because they didn't know that. I say, look, you publish more than cancer research, right? Progress in cancer research, and we're still dealing with centuries-old issues.
Yeah.
But it opens a door to now start looking to get into the model around beliefs and how they drive human behavior. And the tools are fine, the what stuff and the how stuff. I mean, the books that get published on here's what you got to do and here's how you do it. Great. But what we like to focus on is how do you craft beliefs, which really takes, I think, people into a different dimension that we don't teach in our business schools or in our executive training programs, and that is art. You see, the tools are developed because we have a thing called tool seduction as a concept we put into our Tude book. When my co-author Chris was pulling dead bodies off of mountains, they were frozen and clutching their tools. And I said, Chris, dead companies that we do autopsies on are also clutching their tools.
Yes. Yes.
So we think the tools are going to save us. It's not. They're just tools, right?
Right.
But the seduction is because of safety. We think the tools will make us safe. And so we use analysis to understand the world more so we have better control. And if we have more control, then we're safer. And so I think that's where the seduction comes with their tools.
Yes.
One of the questions that I think are important is tools are great and you need them. But are you using them or are they using you? And that's a difference because you could end up being another dead climber or a dead company. And, use your tools. Don't let them use you. And with that, it allows us to say, well, okay, how do we then derive from beliefs? And that's really the domain of art. And art sucks. Art is dangerous. It's uncomfortable. It's not safe. There's no control. And
it's hard to touch.
Yeah, it's crazy.
How do you measure it?
It's like, how many people know an artist? And it's like, don't you notice these are miserable people? I mean,
I have such a daughter trying to survive in Brooklyn. Yep.
The suffering artist syndrome, right? They're striving to master their art. They never feel it.
And I have to keep it pure.
Yes. It's a struggling life. And so I train 700 CEOs a year to be miserable the rest of their life.
Yes. I have been playing a little bit in that field and have taken some courses around the more artistic view towards innovation and leadership and the expansion of the mind and using art to help you do that.
Yeah, because what we ended up doing is we started looking at the basic tool sets that executives use, and then we looked at what are the beliefs missing? What's the art missing around it? So we look at like strategic planning and why was it failing at such high rates? And we began to realize it was the companies that were winning were the ones that were outmaneuvering the thought leaders and the experts and the consultants. They were going in different directions because they were being driven by more intuition. Competitive intuition.
Yes.
And so most strategic plans we find are tactical. They're not strategic.
Oh, totally. Operational.
Yeah.
Stay within that path. And then if you try to break out or someone has a more artistic thought, often they're beaten down.
Yeah.
And it goes back to that fear again.
Yeah.
Then we're not safe. You're taking us into unsafe territory.
I think it's what's interesting. Yeah. I think for entrepreneurs, the reason, so entrepreneurship, because I'm doing a lot of research for this next book, is they have a level to accommodate risk, because risk is fear, and it's not for everybody.
Right.
It's almost biological, as what we're finding out. If you cannot mitigate that fear, you won't move forward.
So what are some of the things that you're doing to help leaders craft beliefs of their teams versus craft strategies that don't get implemented?
Well, first, I think if you can develop the intuitive strategy, in other words, throughout history and even today, by shifting the beliefs around, okay, how do we segment our markets? I mean, why are we using industry standards? Why don't we just choose a new way to segment? And then where are we going to go in that battlefield? And then who's the real threat there? I mean, these are all beliefs that need to mold. And so when we do strategic planning, it's more of that engagement. And it's a breakthrough, because when they get the epiphany of here's the business we're really in, and here's where we're going together, and here's our main threat and how we're going to outmaneuver, now you can start doing things like, okay, how do we structure for this? How do we execute for that? I mean, just all that now becomes easier to define and implement. So we try to work with strategy first, because if that's not clear, all the rest doesn't make any sense. I don't care if you want to restructure or change your culture. Who cares? What does winning mean, and how are you going to do it?
And you lead them through a questioning process, some exercises around mentally challenging that.
Yeah. Before we even get in the room, we do a lot of private interviews, a lot of analysis of their behavior, and we design like a 2-day kickoff event where these questions are previously constructed to lead them to those areas. Those areas are obstacles in their thinking.
Love it. Yeah.
Challenging them. But it's, it takes different types of techniques. I mean, sometimes we're at night around a campfire reading Beowulf. So it really depends on what's needed for the group. But when they get strategic winning, it's such a fine edge, and how they're going to do it, it changes everything.
Yep.
It really does.
That's great. So tell us about your latest book, which is High Altitude Leadership. Does that book incorporate a lot of these ideas? And what's the genesis, the background of that book?
The genesis was we were looking at, actually it was death zone environments. I was climbing with Chris in the Andes. He was leading an expedition. We were climbing the highest altitude volcano in the world. And Chris, we joke about this, like, wow, climbing is a ridiculous sport, but climbing an active volcano is really, now you're out of control. It was during that we got the idea of, because NBC was going to film him doing K2, which is the Death Mountain. It's 10 times more dangerous than Everest. And that was how we wrote the book. He was going to engage that and self-film it, and then link with me via satellite. And we did the book together.
Wow.
So as he's finding body parts and frozen climbers, we're talking and learning about what are humans do in death zone environments. And that's where the book came to be born, because he's there risking his life on this death mountain. I'm back in my living room having
I was going to say, talk about ultimate virtual teaming project.
Right. But it was a risk I was willing to take. And
I might spill my coffee. It's hot.
Fabulous.
But it took off, and it became a great research project working with Chris. He was a brilliant partner in this project.
And what are some of the insights that your readers get from reading High Altitude Leadership?
What's interesting, that leadership is fraught with danger, and we really wanted to take a look at that in different ways. I mean, one of those dangers is like tool seduction, as an example. And so when leaders go through this, they don't realize, like, am I really using this, or is it using me? I mean, the stories that Chris was able to bring into the book makes it read like a novel. It was exciting just, having him go through this. But yeah, we didn't realize it, but you see things. We saw arrogance. We saw selfishness. We saw humans exhibit all the normal behaviors you can exhibit at sea level, but it was in a much more risky environment.
Wow.
It was a great laboratory to explore and see what was actually happening. And so I think the book took off because we were able to expose a lot of this. And so the chapters are around that. And we use the samurai stuff, the fear of death, and because there was one death, which is actually very low for K2 Summit. But there's a great part of the story where all the teams froze from all these countries. And because this Sherpa inexplicably, highly experienced, slid off the ledge. And this, this mountain's like 8,000 meters. But, Chris, once he accepted the death and moved forward, it freed everyone else up to keep going. And
wow.
And so stories like that was really a powerful journey writing this book.
Great. Thanks for sharing that. One last question before we go. What are you thinking about right now that the rest of us are missing?
It's not the first time we've led humans, and we certainly have done this before. But as we got more into this and as I began looking at like entrepreneurship, one of the things that I'm remembering now, our species memory, is that winning does not come necessarily from doing things right. And we have a lot of books on how to win.
Right.
You got to do this right. You got to do that right. And all these books. And here's all the things they did right. All the great companies did this right. But when we pulled back and did the autopsies, we found that most success comes from how you lose.
Yep.
And entrepreneurs that were great, when we look at their history, it's a path of mistakes and errors and failed assumptions and frustrations. And yet, those were the moments where they became entrepreneurs. Those were the moments where they adapted, they learned, they picked themselves up. It was a great samurai quote, like 7 times down, 8 times up. They just kept getting up. And I think that's what we should be teaching, is how to lose powerfully. And that's in my next book. So that's where I'm thinking now.
Do you have a title yet for your next book or not yet?
Not yet. The working title is the winning path, how to lose powerfully, and what we learned from 30,000 CEOs, because I've been really fortunate to be in front of that many CEOs over the past 5 years. So they really gifted me a lot just by allowing me to teach them, but also to learn from them.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to pull all that together.
Great. So how can we find you and learn more about you on the internet?
The main site that we're using, the domain is SAGALeadership.com, and we're trying to pull everything into that.
Great. Well, this has been delightful. Yeah. Jenny is applauding.
I've got the last module for my doctoral class next
There
semester.
she goes. It's all about her class. That's all. It's all about that.
I'm glad I can contribute to academics, and so thank you for...
I'll bring you in.
Right.
I'll make them listen to this.
Yeah. You guys are so close to each other. You actually can bring them in.
Well, we could. Yeah.
That's
I
true.
know. That is so cool. Well, great. So, Don, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. It's been so insightful, and I love people that go against the grain. So thank you so much, Jenny, for co-hosting. And so to our listeners, wow, this has been a really fun one. I think this is our last recording for 2022. This will appear in 2023. So please, if you've really enjoyed, share this with your friends, your colleagues, your family. And we look forward to seeing you next time on our next episode of Team Anywhere.